Hello and welcome to this edition of Back in History. In Back in History, we take you back in time to the events that occurred in the historical past. Today, we continue with our series on Nigeria Biafra War, which lasted from July 1967 to January 1970. When the cost of the war was counted, more than 3 million lives were lost and properties worth billions of naira were destroyed. Some persons, combatants and civilians, sustained injuries that rendered them inactive forever. Others lost family members and their sources of livelihood. Children and adults were subjected to starvation on a scale never before seen. Nigeria was affected by the war, so also was Biafra. All was not well. The war raged on for 3 years, and for 3 years, human beings were dying like flies. Biafra had no standing army and had no sufficient number of ammunition kept in advance for the war. So Biafra became a serious victim of the superior firepower of the federal troops. Biafra did not succumb just like that. Its commander-in-chief, Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, forged on, and his troops continued in the fight for the soul of Biafra. Local artisans, together with university scholars, were assembled to begin the production of locally made warfare. A local bomb called Bunigwe was invented and deployed effectively to keep the fight on. But despite the resilience, the Biafran side was still susceptible to the superior firepower of the Nigerian troops, who prosecuted the war with modern warfare and a good number of men and women who were duly trained for war long before the war, even in their classrooms. When the federal troops were closing in on Ojukwu's command headquarters in Umuahia, Ojukwu took the decision to flee from Biafra. He left in the last flight at night from Uli Airstrip together with members of his cabinet and his family members, and departed to Ivory Coast, where he stayed in exile for 13 years before later returning to Nigeria upon getting a presidential pardon. Ojukwu then handed over what remained of Biafra into the hands of Effiong, who was his chief of army staff at the time and his second in command. Ojukwu charged him to continue with the fight for the soul of Biafra. Philip weighed the situation critically and came to the conclusion that continuing the fight was to further plunge the remaining people of Biafra into death and excruciating pains and starvation. He then held a meeting with the remaining leaders of Biafra and obtained the authorization to discontinue the war and surrender Biafra to the federal government of Nigeria. There were so many wonders in war-torn Biafra, and one of such was Radio Biafra. This radio was aired live every day, 24 hours in the bush, and was never discovered by the federal troops. The transmitters were mounted on makeshift platforms. It became the main propaganda instrument in the hands of the Biafran leadership. We shall discuss this radio in our subsequent episode. It was in this radio station that Effiong took to the mic to announce the surrender of Biafra to the hearing of the people of Biafra, many of whom had Radio Biafra in their transistor radio as their only companion. The speech was made at exactly 4:40 p.m. local time on Monday, 12 January 1970. Here is the full text of the speech. Quote, "Fellow countrymen, as you all know, I was asked to be the officer administering the government of this republic on 10th of January 1970. Since then, I know that some of you have been waiting to hear a statement from me. I have had extensive consultations with the leadership of the community, both military and civil, and I am now encouraged and hasten to make these statements to you by the mandate of the armed forces and the people of this country. I have assumed the leadership of the government. Throughout history, injured people have had to resort to arms in their self-defense where peaceful negotiations fail. We are no exception. We took up arms because of the sense of insecurity generated in our people by the events of 1966. We have fought in defense of that cause. I take this opportunity to congratulate officers and men of our armed forces for their gallantry and bravery, which have earned for them the admiration of the whole world. I thank the civil population for their steadfastness and courage in the face of overwhelming odds and starvation. He continued, still on quote, "I am convinced now that a stop must be put to the bloodshed which is going on as a result of the war. I am also convinced that the suffering of our people must be brought to an immediate end. Our people are now disillusioned, and those elements of the old government regime who have made negotiations and reconciliation impossible have voluntarily removed themselves from our midst. I have therefore instructed an orderly disengagement of troops." Philip Effiong continued, still on quote, "I am dispatching emissaries to make contact with Nigeria's field commanders in places like Onitsha, Owerri, Awka, Enugu, and Calabar with a view to arranging armistice. I urge on General Gowon in the name of humanity to order his troops to pause while an armistice is negotiated in order to avoid the mass suffering caused by the movement of population. We have always believed that our differences with Nigeria should be settled by peaceful negotiations. A delegation is therefore ready to meet representatives of Nigeria's federal government anywhere to negotiate a peaceful settlement on the basis of the OAU resolutions. The delegation will consist of the Chief Justice Alois Mbanefo as leader, Professor Eni Njoku, Mr. J.I. Emembolu, Chief A.E. Basi, and Mr. E. Aguma. The delegation will have full authority to negotiate on our behalf." He went on to say, still on quote, "I have appointed a council to advise me on the government of the country. It consists of the Chief Justice Alois Mbanefo, Brigadier P.C. Amadi, Army, Brigadier C.A. Nwankwo, Army, Captain W.A. Anuku, Navy, Wing Commander J.I. Ezero, Air Force, Mr. P.I. Okeke, Inspector General of Police, Mr. J.I. Emembolu, Attorney General, Professor Eni Njoku, Dr. I. Eke, Chief A.E. Udofia, Chief A.E. Basi, Mr. Matthew T. Mbu, Mr. E. Aguma, Chief Frank Pigo, and Chief J.M. Echeru. Any question of a government in exile is repudiated by our people." Philip Effiong stated further, still on quote, "Civilian populations are hereby advised to remain calm and to cooperate with the armed forces and the police in the maintenance of law and order. They should remain in their homes and stop mass movements which have increased suffering and loss of lives. On behalf of our people, I thank those foreign governments and friends who have steadfastly given us support in our cause. We shall continue to count on their continued help and counsel. I also thank His Holiness the Pope, the Joint Church Aid, and other relief organizations for the help they have given for the relief of suffering and starvation. I appeal to all governments to give urgent help for the relief and to prevail on the federal military government to order their troops to stop all military operations. May God help us all." End of quotes. This speech marked the end of a long-drawn war that had lasted for 3 unbroken years, consuming several lives in its belly. By this speech, the Republic of Biafra effectively ceased to fight and thus returned allegiance to the federal government of Nigeria. It was a relief to the suffering and beleaguered people of Biafra who had lived in fear for 3 years and who had seen their dear ones being killed in mortal combats between the armed forces of Nigeria and of Biafra. It has been reported, however, that not everyone was happy with Philip Effiong's speech surrendering Biafra, but there was little or nothing they could do, more so as Philip Effiong had taken the precaution to consult widely with the remaining Biafran leadership, military, and civilians. The civilian population in the entire eastern region had become the worst hit by the exchange of gunfire, and the suffering was too much, and the weight of opinion in support of the cessation of the war was indeed overwhelming. The Igbos in particular had lost so much in men and resources. Most of their houses and businesses in Port Harcourt, for instance, were confiscated under the obnoxious umbrella of abandoned property. Philip Effiong's termination of the war was thus a huge relief to many. At the time of the surrender speech on Radio Nigeria, Ojukwu was in faraway Ivory Coast. He left Biafra 2 days earlier with his wife, members of his family, and leaders of Biafra and other selected persons. He left in a cargo plane which took off from Uli airstrip. It has been reported that Ojukwu was not pleased upon receiving news about the surrender of Biafra to Nigeria. He expected that the fight ought to have continued, even in his absence, till the realization of the Biafran dream. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. I remain your friend and host, Ekemini Udim.